The dust swirled like angry spirits across the barren landscape, as Grace Norwood clutched her shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders, the fever burning through her body making the October evening feel impossibly cold. It was 1878, and the unforgiving terrain of western Utah had claimed many lives before hers. She feared she would be next. Her wagon sat broken and abandoned 3 miles back. Her traveling companions had succumbed to the same illness days ago, and now she stumbled forward on pure instinct, the distant lights of Kelton her only hope in the gathering darkness. The town of Kelton had sprung up like many others along the Transcontinental Railroad, a collection of wooden buildings, saloons, and desperate souls looking to strike it rich in the vast, unexplored territories. Grace had never intended to travel this far west. At 23, she had left her home in Boston following the death of her parents, answering an advertisement to serve as a schoolteacher in Salt Lake City. The journey had been arduous, and when fever struck their small wagon party, everything changed. Her vision blurred as she stumbled over a rock, sending her sprawling into the dirt. The impact barely registered through her fever-addled mind. How long had she been sick? 2 days? 3? Time had lost all meaning. She tried to push herself up, but her arms gave way and she collapsed back to the ground. The distant lights of Kelton seemed to mock her now, so close yet impossibly far. "Please," she whispered, though there was no one to hear her pleas. Her throat was parched, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Please, I don't want to die here." The sound came first, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against packed earth. Grace tried to lift her head but couldn't summon the strength. Was she hallucinating? It wouldn't be the first time the fever had played tricks on her mind. Then came a voice, deep and concerned. "Madam." "Good Lord, what happened to you?" Grace forced her eyes open, struggling to focus on the figure that had dismounted and now knelt beside her. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features, but she could make out a strong jaw lined with stubble. "Fever," she managed to rasp. "Everyone else dead." The man touched her forehead with a calloused hand that felt blissfully cool against her burning skin. "You're burning up something fierce." He hesitated only a moment before making a decision. "I'm taking you to town. Dr. Simmons might still be awake." Before she could respond, the stranger lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, cradling her against his chest. The world tilted sickeningly as he placed her on his horse before mounting behind her. "I'm going to die," Grace whispered, her greatest fear escaping her lips as she leaned back against the solid warmth of the stranger's chest. His arms tightened around her as he gathered the reins. "You'll wake up to a better morning," the cowboy said with quiet certainty. "I promise you that." Grace wanted to believe him, but the darkness was closing in. The last thing she remembered was the steady heartbeat at her back and the gentle rocking motion of the horse beneath them as consciousness slipped away. Ethan Keller had not planned on saving anyone's life that evening. At 30 years old, he had long ago accepted his role as Kelton's deputy sheriff, a position that often required him to be the bearer of bad news rather than good. The railroad had brought prosperity to the small Utah town, but also its share of troublemakers, desperate folk, and tragedy. He had been returning from investigating reports of cattle rustling at the Peterson Ranch when he spotted the figure collapsed on the trail. In the fading light, he'd almost ridden past, mistaking her for a bundle of discarded clothing. It was only when he'd noticed the faint movement that he realized it was a person. Now, with the unconscious woman secured in front of him, Ethan urged his horse to a gallop. Kelton wasn't known for its medical facilities. They had one overworked doctor who divided his time between 3 settlements, but it was her only chance. "Hang on," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and rapid. The heat radiating from her body concerned him greatly. He'd seen enough fever victims during his years on the frontier to know when someone was fighting for their life. The lights of Kelton grew closer, and Ethan guided his horse down the main street. Despite the late hour, the saloon was still lively, piano music and raucous laughter spilling into the street. He bypassed it completely, heading for the small building at the edge of town that served as both doctor's office and residence. Doc Simmons. Ethan called, reining his horse to a stop and dismounting carefully while supporting the woman. "Doc, I need help." The door opened, revealing a gray-haired man with spectacles perched on his nose and suspenders over his wrinkled shirt. Dr. James Simmons had been practicing medicine in the West for over 30 years, and little surprised him anymore. "What have we here, Deputy?" he asked, holding the door wider as Ethan carried the woman inside. "Found her collapsed on the trail to town. High fever. Says the others traveling with her are dead." The doctor's expression grew grave. "Bring her to the back room, quickly now." The examination room was small but clean, with a narrow bed against one wall. Ethan laid the woman down gently, struck by how fragile she appeared in the lamplight. Her chestnut hair was matted with dust and sweat, her skin flushed with fever, but even in her disheveled state, there was a quiet dignity to her features. "What's her name?" the doctor asked as he began his examination. "Don't know. She barely managed to tell me about the fever before she lost consciousness." Dr. Simmons nodded, placing a stethoscope against her chest. "Her heart's racing. Help me get some of these layers off, we need to cool her down." Ethan assisted as best he could, removing the woman's dusty boots and outer garments while the doctor prepared a basin of cool water and herbs. It felt invasive to undress a stranger, but the urgency of her condition overrode any sense of impropriety. "Is it contagious?" Ethan asked, suddenly aware of the potential danger to the town. "Hard to say without knowing what we're dealing with," the doctor replied, soaking a cloth and placing it on the woman's forehead. "Could be mountain fever, typhoid, influenza. Best you wash up thoroughly just in case." As Ethan scrubbed his hands at the basin in the corner, he noticed a small leather satchel still clutched in the woman's hand. With the doctor's permission, he carefully extracted it, hoping to find some clue to her identity. Inside was a neatly folded letter of employment addressed to Miss Grace Norwood, offering her a position as a schoolteacher in Salt Lake City. There was also a small daguerreotype of an older couple, presumably her parents, and a modest amount of money, not enough to start a new life, but perhaps all she had in the world. "Her name's Grace Norwood," Ethan said, returning to the doctor's side. "Looks like she was headed to Salt Lake City to be a schoolteacher." "Well, Miss Norwood picked a bad time to fall ill in the middle of nowhere," Dr. Simmons remarked, preparing a tincture. "I'm going to need your help, Deputy." "She's going to need round-the-clock care if she's going to pull through." Ethan hesitated. He had responsibilities, duties to the town, but something about the woman's desperate situation stirred something protective in him. Perhaps it was the way she'd looked at him when he found her, with equal parts terror and hope. Or maybe it was the promise he'd made that she would wake up to a better morning. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. For the next several hours, Ethan assisted the doctor in treating Grace's fever. They took turns applying cool compresses, coaxing small sips of water between her parched lips, and monitoring her breathing. When she began to thrash in delirium, calling out for people who weren't there, Ethan held her shoulders gently but firmly to prevent her from harming herself. "She's fighting hard," Dr. Simmons observed as dawn approached. The older man looked exhausted, the lines in his face deeper than usual. "You should get some rest, Deputy. I can manage for a few hours. Ethan shook his head. I told her she'd wake up to a better morning. I aim to be here when she does. The doctor raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, stubborn as always. Well, at least take this chair. No sense in both of us being dead on our feet. Ethan settled into the wooden chair beside Grace's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. In the quiet hours before dawn, he found himself studying her face, wondering what kind of life she had led before fate brought her to the brink of death on the trail to Kelton. A schoolteacher from back east, she must be educated, refined. What had driven her to seek a new life in the untamed West? As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Grace's breathing seemed to ease. The desperate gasping that had concerned them throughout the night gradually transformed into a more regular rhythm. The flush in her cheeks began to recede, and when Dr. Simmons checked her temperature, he gave a cautious nod of approval. "The fever's breaking," he announced. "She's not out of the woods yet, but it's a good sign." Ethan felt a disproportionate sense of relief wash over him. Will she recover fully? Time will tell. Whatever illness struck her down has taken its toll. She'll be weak for some time. As if on cue, Grace's eyelids fluttered. Ethan leaned forward, watching intently as she struggled toward consciousness. When her eyes finally opened, they were a startling shade of green, clouded with confusion as they darted around the unfamiliar room before settling on Ethan's face. "Where?" Her voice was barely audible, a dry whisper. Ethan reached for the water glass, helping her take a small sip before answering. "You're in Kelton, Miss Norwood. I'm Deputy Ethan Keller. I found you on the trail yesterday evening and brought you to our doctor." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The cowboy," she murmured. "You said I'd wake to a better morning." A smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. "And so you have. Your fever's breaking." Grace closed her eyes briefly as if gathering her strength. When she opened them again, there was gratitude mingled with grief. "The others, my traveling companions." "They're really gone." "I'm afraid so, madam. We'll send someone to recover them once you're well enough to tell us where." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I barely knew them. We met in Omaha, decided to travel together for safety." Her voice broke. "They were kind people." Dr. Simmons approached, giving Grace a gentle smile. "You need rest, Miss Norwood. Your body has fought a hard battle." "Where will I go?" The question held a note of panic. "I have nothing, my trunk, my belongings, they're all with the wagon." "Don't worry about that now," Ethan said firmly. "Kelton takes care of its own." "But I'm not, you are now," he interrupted, surprising himself with his conviction. "Rest. We'll figure everything out later." As Grace drifted back to sleep, Ethan exchanged a look with the doctor. They both knew the challenges that lay ahead for a single woman stranded in a frontier town without resources. But something told Ethan that Grace Norwood was stronger than she appeared. She had survived when others had perished, had fought through a fever that would have claimed many lives. "I need to inform Sheriff Patterson about what's happened," Ethan said, rising from his chair, "and arrange to recover the bodies of her traveling companions." "And after that?" the doctor asked, a knowing look in his eyes. Ethan glanced back at the sleeping woman. "After that, I intend to keep my promise. Every morning better than the last." Over the next 3 days, Grace's condition improved steadily. The fever disappeared completely, but left her weakened and unable to leave her bed. Dr. Simmons arranged for her to stay in a small room attached to his clinic, normally reserved for patients needing extended care. The women of Kelton, hearing of her plight, rallied to provide her with clothing, toiletries, and other necessities. Ethan visited daily, often bringing small gifts, a book from the general store, wildflowers he'd picked on patrol, news from town to keep her mind occupied. He told himself it was simply his duty to check on the welfare of someone he'd rescued, but he knew there was more to it. There was something about Grace that drew him in, perhaps her quiet strength, or the flashes of wit that emerged as she regained her health. On the fourth day, he arrived to find her sitting up in a chair by the window, dressed in a simple blue calico dress donated by the minister's wife. The sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her hair, which had been washed and neatly braided. She looked like a different person from the fever-stricken woman he'd found on the trail. "Deputy Keller," she greeted him with a small smile. "Dr. Simmons said you might stop by." "Miss Norwood," he replied, removing his hat. "You're looking well. Thanks to you and the doctor, and please call me Grace. After all you've done for me, formality seems unnecessary." Ethan nodded. "Grace it is, and I'm Ethan when I'm not on official business." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Ethan cleared his throat. "I've brought news. We recovered your trunk from the wagon. It's a bit weather-worn, but the contents should be intact." Grace's eyes widened. "You found the wagon, and the others?" "We did," Ethan confirmed somberly. "They've been properly buried. The minister said words over them. I wrote down the location in case you ever want to visit." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you. That's more than I hoped for." She hesitated. "Did you find any clues about what made them sick?" "What made me sick?" "Dr. Simmons thinks it was typhoid fever. There's been cases reported up and down the territory this season. You were lucky catching it early, and getting treatment made the difference." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "And the wagon, my belongings? What could be salvaged is at the sheriff's office. I can have it brought here when you're ready." She twisted her hands in her lap. "That's very kind, but I shouldn't impose on the doctor's hospitality much longer. I need to figure out what comes next." "Have you given any thought to your plans?" Ethan asked carefully. "The position in Salt Lake City was supposed to start last week. I imagine they've found someone else by now." She sighed. "I have some savings, but not enough to get back east. I suppose I'll need to find work here until I can afford passage." Ethan shifted his weight, considering his next words carefully. "As it happens, Kelton's been looking for a teacher. The railroad brings more families every month, and the children need proper schooling. The last teacher left when she married a cattle baron from Wyoming." Hope flickered across Grace's face. "A teaching position. Here. It's not much. The schoolhouse is just a converted storage building, and the pay is modest. But there's a small house that comes with it. Nothing fancy, but it would be a roof over your head." "That sounds perfect, actually." The relief in her voice was palpable. "But would the town trust a stranger with educating their children?" Ethan smiled. "You're not exactly a stranger anymore. Word travels fast in Kelton. The women who have been helping with your care have been singing your praises, especially Mrs. Patterson, the sheriff's wife. She's on the town council and has considerable influence." Grace's expression brightened. "I would be forever grateful for the opportunity. Teaching is my calling. I had just begun my career back in Boston when my parents passed away." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ethan said sincerely. "Thank you. They were wonderful people. Father was a professor at Harvard and Mother taught piano. Education was the foundation of our home." A bittersweet smile crossed her face. "When they died of influenza last winter, the house had to be sold to settle debts. I decided a fresh start might be healing." Ethan was struck by the parallels in their stories, both orphaned, both seeking new beginnings in the West. He had lost his own parents to a fire when he was 19, prompting his journey from Pennsylvania to the frontier. "I'll speak to the town council on your behalf," he promised. "They meet tomorrow evening." "Why are you helping me so much?" Grace asked suddenly, her green eyes searching his face. You've gone far beyond your duty as deputy. The question caught Ethan off guard. Why was he so invested in her welfare? He could have simply brought her to the doctor and considered his duty fulfilled. Yet here he was, planning her future in Kelton as if her presence in town and his life was a foregone conclusion. "I suppose I know what it's like to be alone in a strange place," he said finally. "When I first came west, a few good people made all the difference for me. I'm just passing along the kindness." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Grace seemed to accept his answer, though something in her expression suggested she sensed there was more to it. "Well, I'm grateful, whatever your reasons," she said softly. "And I promise not to be a burden for long." "You're not a burden, Grace, not to me." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Dr. Simmons entered the room, breaking the moment. "Deputy Keller, good to see you." "Miss Norwood, it's time for your tonic." Ethan rose, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll let you rest, and I'll speak to the council about the teaching position." As he left the clinic, Ethan found himself whistling a habit he'd all but abandoned in recent years. Something about Grace Norwood had awakened a long, dormant part of him, a part that looked forward to tomorrow rather than merely enduring it. The town council met in the back room of Kelton's only hotel, a relatively grand two-story building that served as the social hub for the community's more prosperous citizens. Ethan arrived early, nodding to the familiar faces already assembled: Mayor Henderson, a former railroad executive; Mrs. Patterson, the sheriff's formidable wife; Mr. Collins, who owned the general store; and Pastor Williams, who also served as the town's record keeper. Sheriff Patterson arrived moments later, clapping Ethan on the shoulder as he passed. "Evening, Deputy. Here you're championing our mysterious patient for the teaching position." "She's well qualified," Ethan replied neutrally. "Harvard-educated father, teaching experience in Boston. Seems a stroke of luck for Kelton." The sheriff hummed noncommittally. "Convenient timing, I'll say that much." Before Ethan could respond, Mayor Henderson called the meeting to order. Various town matters were discussed: complaints about drainage issues near the railroad depot, proposals for a harvest festival, concerns about winter supplies. Finally, the mayor turned to the matter of the vacant teaching position. "I understand our deputy has a candidate in mind," he said, nodding toward Ethan. Ethan stood, presenting Grace's qualifications as concisely as he could. He emphasized her education, her previous teaching experience, and her perseverance in the face of tragedy. He carefully avoided any mention of his personal interest in her welfare. "And you can vouch for her character?" Pastor Williams asked, peering over his spectacles. "I can," Ethan confirmed. "As can Dr. Simmons and the women who have assisted in her care." Mrs. Patterson nodded emphatically. "The girl has a good head on her shoulders, educated, polite, and grateful for assistance without being simpering about it. I like her." Coming from the sheriff's wife, this was high praise indeed. Josephine Patterson was known for her exacting standards and blunt assessments of character. "What about her health?" Mr. Collins inquired. "We can't have someone relapsing and leaving our children without instruction mid-term." "Dr. Simmons has certified that she's recovered and will regain her full strength within a week or two," Ethan answered. The illness left no lasting damage. The council members exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years working together. "Well," Mayor Henderson said finally, "it seems Providence has sent us a qualified teacher just when we needed one. Unless there are any objections, I move that we offer Miss Norwood the position on a trial basis of 3 months, after which we can make a more permanent arrangement if all goes well." The motion passed unanimously. Ethan felt a disproportionate sense of satisfaction as he left the meeting. He could already imagine Grace's reaction to the news, the way her green eyes would light up, the smile that would transform her face. He was so preoccupied with these thoughts that he nearly collided with a man exiting the saloon across the street. Ethan steadied himself, recognizing Harvey Wilson, one of the railroad workers known for his quick temper and quicker fists. "Watch where you're going, Deputy," Wilson slurred, alcohol heavy on his breath. "Evening, Wilson. Might be time to call it a night," Ethan suggested evenly. Wilson's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me what to do. Just because you wear that tin star doesn't make you better than me." Ethan sighed inwardly. He wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but Wilson seemed determined to provoke one. "Go home, Harvey. Sleep it off. Or what? You'll arrest me." Wilson took a step closer. "Heard you've been playing nursemaid to some half-dead woman. That your job now, tending to strays." Something hot and dangerous flared in Ethan's chest. "That's enough," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Miss Norwood is a lady and deserves your respect." Wilson snorted. "Lady, out here alone. More likely she's running from something or someone." Ethan's hand moved to his holster, a reflex he immediately regretted. Wilson noticed, a mean smile spreading across his face. "Going to shoot me for speaking my mind, Deputy? That's not very lawful." "No," Ethan forced himself to relax. "But I will arrest you for public drunkenness if you don't move along." For a tense moment, Wilson seemed to consider pushing further. Then he spat on the ground near Ethan's boots and stumbled away, muttering curses. The encounter left Ethan unsettled. He wasn't prone to losing his temper, yet Wilson's insinuations about Grace had sparked an immediate protective rage. It was unprofessional and potentially dangerous, exactly the kind of emotional response that could get a lawman killed in a territory where violence often erupted without warning. Still troubled, he changed his plans and headed for the small cabin he maintained at the edge of town rather than returning immediately to the clinic with the good news. He needed time to sort through his confused feelings before seeing Grace again. The cabin was sparse but comfortable, a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. A bookshelf filled with dog-eared volumes spoke to Ethan's love of reading, a passion he rarely revealed to others in a town where practical skills were valued over book learning. He lit the lamp and sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. What was it about Grace Norwood that affected him so strongly? He had encountered many people in need during his years as deputy: widows, orphans, victims of various misfortunes. He had always helped when he could, but maintained a professional distance. Yet with Grace, that distance had evaporated almost immediately. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in her eyes when she'd asked where she would go, or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which she bore her losses. Whatever it was, Ethan knew he was treading dangerous ground. Kelton was a small town, and people talked. His special attention to the new arrival had already been noticed, as Wilson's taunting had made clear. For Grace's sake, he needed to be more circumspect. A single woman had a precarious enough position in frontier society, without rumors of impropriety surrounding her arrival. If she was to establish herself as the town's teacher, respectability would be essential. Ethan resolved to deliver the news about the teaching position and then step back, allowing Grace to find her place in Kelton without his constant presence raising eyebrows. It was the right thing to do, even if the prospect left an unexpected hollowness in his chest. The next morning, Ethan waited until after breakfast to visit the clinic. He found Grace in the garden behind Dr. Simmons's house, seated on a bench in the morning sunshine. She wore the same blue calico dress, but her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the light. She was reading a book, so absorbed that she didn't notice his approach until he was nearly beside her. "Ethan," she exclaimed, looking up with a smile that made his carefully constructed resolutions waver. "Good morning." "Morning, Grace. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." She closed the book, keeping her finger between the pages to mark her place. "Just revisiting Wuthering Heights. Mrs. Patterson lent it to me. She has quite the impressive library." Ethan nodded. The Pattersons are well-read folk. Sheriff brought most of their books from back east when they settled here. "It's a comfort to know that literature has made its way even to the frontier," Grace said. "Books have always been my solace in difficult times." "Mine too," Ethan admitted before he could stop himself. Seeing her surprise, he added awkwardly, "Though I don't get as much time for reading as I'd like." Grace's expression softened with interest. "What do you enjoy reading when you have the chance?" The question was innocent enough, but Ethan felt oddly exposed. His reading habits were something he rarely discussed. History mostly, some philosophy, and poetry sometimes. "Poetry," her eyes lit up. "Any particular poet, Whitman," he answered, feeling his cheeks warm slightly. "His work captures something essential about America, the vastness, the possibility. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you," Grace quoted softly. Ethan stared at her in surprise. "You know Song of Myself?" "My father adored Whitman. He would read Leaves of Grass aloud in the evenings." Her smile turned wistful. Mother pretended to be scandalized, but she loved it too. There was a moment of silence between them, filled with unexpected understanding. Ethan cleared his throat. "I came to tell you about the town council meeting. They've offered you the teaching position." Grace's face transformed with joy. "Truly? Oh, Ethan, that's wonderful news. It's initially for a 3-month trial period, but that's standard procedure. The schoolhouse isn't much to look at, but the teacher's cottage is comfortable enough. Once you're fully recovered, I can show you both. I can't thank you enough for advocating for me." She reached out impulsively, placing her hand on his arm. "You've been my guardian angel since you found me on that trail." The touch sent an unexpected warmth through him, and Ethan took an instinctive step back, remembering his resolution. "Just doing what anyone would do," he said, more gruffly than he intended. Grace withdrew her hand, a flicker of hurt crossing her features before she composed herself. "Of course. Still, I'm grateful." Ethan regretted his abruptness immediately but didn't know how to undo it without making things more awkward. "The school term is set to begin in 2 weeks. Do you think you'll be ready by then? Dr. Simmons says I'm making excellent progress. I'm sure I'll be perfectly capable by then." Her tone was polite but cooler than before. "Good," Ethan nodded, hating the sudden formality between them but not knowing how to bridge it. "I'll have your trunk delivered to the teacher's cottage tomorrow, and Mrs. Patterson mentioned she has some household items to contribute." "The people of Kelton have been remarkably generous," Grace said. "I look forward to repaying that kindness through my service to their children." An awkward silence fell. Ethan shifted his weight, acutely aware that he had damaged the easy rapport they had been building. "Well, I should get back to my rounds. Sheriff likes the town thoroughly patrolled on Saturdays, more drinking, more potential for trouble." "Of course. Thank you for bringing the news." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but something made him pause and look back. "Grace?" "Yes." There was a cautious hope in her eyes that made his chest tighten. "I meant what I said that first night. Every morning will be better than the last. Kelton is a good town with good people. You'll find your place here." A small smile returned to her lips. "I believe I already have." Ethan nodded once more and departed, his emotions in greater turmoil than before. He had intended to create distance between them for Grace's sake, but in doing so, he had only made himself more acutely aware of how much he wanted to be near her. It was a complication he hadn't anticipated and didn't know how to resolve. Over the next week, Ethan kept his interactions with Grace brief and public. He escorted her and Mrs. Patterson to view the schoolhouse and teacher's cottage, maintaining a professional demeanor throughout. The schoolhouse was indeed modest, a single room with rows of rough-hewn benches and desks, a blackboard at the front, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner for the winter months. The cottage behind it was small but solid, with 2 rooms, a fireplace, and a garden plot that had gone to seed during the previous teacher's absence. Despite its humble appearance, Grace had been delighted with both buildings. "I can already envision how to arrange everything," she'd said, eyes bright with plans. "The children will need proper writing materials, of course, and more books. Perhaps we could organize a donation drive." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and soon several of the town's women had formed a committee to prepare the school and cottage for the new term. Ethan watched from a distance as Grace integrated herself into the community, winning people over with her genuine warmth and evident capability. By the time she moved from Dr. Simmons's clinic to the teacher's cottage, she had already become a valued member of Kelton society. Ethan told himself he was pleased by this development. It was exactly what he had hoped for Grace, finding her place without depending on his intervention. Yet he couldn't deny the hollow feeling that grew each time he saw her engaged in animated conversation with others, while maintaining a polite distance from him. On the Sunday before school was set to begin, the entire town gathered for services at the small church. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about new beginnings, which everyone understood was aimed at welcoming Grace officially to the community. After the service, Mayor Henderson introduced her formally to those few residents who hadn't yet made her acquaintance. Ethan stood at the back of the crowd, observing as Grace charmed even the most taciturn of Kelton's citizens. She wore a dress of deep green that complemented her eyes, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. She looked completely recovered from her ordeal, her cheeks flushed with health and excitement rather than fever. "You're staring, Deputy," Sheriff Patterson commented, appearing at Ethan's side. "Not very subtle." Ethan straightened, embarrassed at being caught. "Just making sure Miss Norwood is settling in properly." "Hum," the sheriff hummed skeptically. "Seems to me you've taken quite the interest in our new teacher's welfare." "I found her half dead on the trail." "Natural to feel some responsibility," Ethan defended. Not meeting his superior's knowing gaze, Sheriff Patterson stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Responsibility, is it? Well, whatever you call it, you might want to act on it before someone else does. I've noticed Harvey Wilson paying her particular attention lately." Ethan's head snapped up. "Wilson, he's not fit to," he stopped himself, realizing he was confirming the sheriff's suspicions. Patterson laughed. "That's what I thought. For what it's worth, Josephine thinks highly of Miss Norwood. Says she has a good head on her shoulders and a kind heart, the kind of woman who'd make a fine wife for a certain deputy who's been alone too long." "Sheriff," Ethan began, but Patterson held up a hand. "Just an observation, Keller. What you do with it is your business." With that, he wandered off to join his wife, leaving Ethan to his troubled thoughts. Across the churchyard, Grace was indeed speaking with Harvey Wilson, who had clearly made an effort to sober up and clean himself for the occasion. Ethan watched as Wilson leaned closer than was strictly proper, saying something that made Grace take a subtle step back. The sight sent a surge of protective anger through him, but he forced himself to remain where he was. Grace was more than capable of handling unwanted attention, and his intervention would only fuel town gossip. As if sensing his gaze, Grace glanced in his direction. Their eyes met briefly before she returned her attention to Wilson, making some excuse that allowed her to move away toward a group of women. Wilson looked disappointed but didn't follow. The rest of the afternoon passed in the usual Sunday socializing. Ethan maintained his distance from Grace, exchanging only the most basic pleasantries when their paths crossed. By the time he returned to his cabin that evening, he had convinced himself that this was the proper course: professional, respectful, and considerate of her reputation. He was therefore surprised when a knock came at his door just after sunset. Opening it, he found Grace standing on his threshold, a determined expression on her face. "Miss Norwood," he said, reverting to formality in his surprise. "Is everything all right? May I come in, Deputy?" she asked, emphasizing his title with a hint of irritation. Or would that be too improper? Ethan hesitated, acutely aware of how it would look if anyone saw the town's new teacher entering the bachelor deputy's cabin at dusk. But something in Grace's expression told him this conversation couldn't be avoided. "Of course." He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Grace glanced around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings and the well-stocked bookshelf with evident interest. "So this is where you hide away?" "I wouldn't call it hiding," Ethan replied, closing the door but leaving it slightly ajar for propriety's sake. "Just where I live, and read poetry." There was a challenge in her voice. Ethan sighed. "Grace, why are you here?" She turned to face him fully, chin raised. "I want to know why you've been avoiding me. One moment we're having meaningful conversations about literature, and the next you can barely look at me. Have I offended you in some way?" "No, of course not." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "It's not that at all." "Then what is it?" "Because I value honesty, Deputy Keller, and I'd appreciate some from you now." The formality stung, but Ethan recognized it as a shield, the same one he'd been using. "I was trying to be considerate of your position. A single woman in a small town has to be careful of her reputation." "My attention could be misconstrued." Grace's expression softened slightly. "So you've been deliberately distant for my benefit, to protect my reputation?" "Yes." "Did it occur to you to ask what I wanted?" The challenge was back in her voice. "Or did you just decide what was best for me?" Ethan blinked, taken aback. I thought it was obvious." "Nothing is obvious, Ethan. People aren't obvious." She took a step closer. "I came to Kelton because of tragedy, but I've stayed because I found something I wasn't expecting." "What's that?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. "Hope," she said simply. "The possibility of belonging, of mattering to someone." The air between them seemed to change, charged with unspoken possibilities. Ethan found himself acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of the determined set of her mouth. "You matter, Grace," he said finally. "To the town, to the children who'll be in your care, to me." "Then why push me away?" "Because," Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words, "because I'm not sure I know how to do this. Whatever this is between us." Grace's expression softened. "Neither do I. But I know that when you found me on that trail, fevered and frightened, you promised me a better morning. And every morning since has been better because you were in it, even at a distance." The sincerity in her voice undid the last of Ethan's reservations. "I've never met anyone like you," he admitted. "You've faced loss and hardship, yet you remain so hopeful. It's remarkable." "Hope is a choice," Grace replied. "One I make every day, just as you choose to serve this town, to protect its people, to find half-dead schoolteachers on lonely trails." A smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "When you put it that way." "I'm not asking for declarations or promises, Ethan. I'm just asking you to stop avoiding me. Let's discover what this could be day by day." It seemed so simple when she said it, so reasonable. The concerns that had tied him in knots for days dissolved in the face of her straightforward approach. "I can do that," he agreed. Day by day, Grace smiled, the tension leaving her shoulders. "Good. Now, would you like to escort me home? It's getting dark, and I have 20 eager students to prepare for tomorrow." Ethan reached for his hat. "It would be my pleasure, Miss Norwood." As they walked through the quiet streets of Kelton toward the teacher's cottage, maintaining a proper distance, but with a new understanding between them, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The future stretched before them, unwritten but full of possibility, better mornings waiting to unfold. The first day of school dawned clear and bright, a perfect September morning that seemed to promise good things ahead. Grace had been up since before sunrise, arranging her small classroom, writing her name neatly on the blackboard, and placing the donated books on the shelf beside her desk. By the time the first students began to arrive, she was ready, standing at the door to greet each one with a warm smile. They came in all ages, from 6-year-olds clutching their mother's hands to teenagers trying to appear too grown for school while secretly excited for the new teacher. By 9 o'clock, 22 students had filled the benches, watching Grace with expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I am Miss Norwood, and I am honored to be your teacher. Before we begin our studies, I'd like to learn a little about each of you." One by one, the children introduced themselves: the Peterson twins, whose father owned the largest ranch outside town; the Collins children, offspring of the general store owner; the Wilsons, whose father worked for the railroad; and many others whose parents were farmers, craftsmen, or railroad employees. Grace made notes as they spoke, committing their names and faces to memory. The day passed in a whirlwind of assessments and organization. Grace quickly discovered the wide range of educational backgrounds among her students. Some could barely recognize letters, while others had been well schooled before their families moved west. By afternoon, she had developed a preliminary plan to group them by ability rather than age for certain subjects. When the last child had departed, Grace sank into her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. Teaching had always been her passion, and despite the challenges ahead, she felt she had found her purpose in Kelton. A knock at the open doorway pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan stood there, hat in hand, a bouquet of wildflowers in his other hand. "Thought the teacher might appreciate a first-day gift," he said with a smile. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "How thoughtful! They're beautiful." She rose to accept the flowers, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "How did it go?" Ethan asked, glancing around the classroom. "Wonderfully. Exhausting, but wonderful. The children are eager to learn, which is half the battle." She located an empty jar, filled it with water from the bucket in the corner, and arranged the flowers on her desk. "Did you come all this way just to bring me flowers?" "Partly," Ethan admitted. "Also wanted to invite you to dinner at the hotel restaurant. Thought you might be too tired to cook after your first day." The invitation surprised her. It was their first public social engagement beyond the necessities of her arrival and settlement. "I'd like that," she said after a moment. "Give me a few minutes to tidy up here." While Grace organized her materials for the next day, Ethan wandered the classroom, examining the children's work displayed on the walls. "You've accomplished a lot in one day," he observed. "Maps, arithmetic exercises, writing samples." "I needed to assess where everyone stands," Grace explained. "The range of abilities is considerable. Several of the older boys have had almost no formal education." "Not surprising," Ethan nodded. "Many families came west for opportunity, not education. Some of those boys have been working alongside their fathers since they could hold tools." "Well, they deserve the chance to learn," Grace said firmly. "Everyone does." Ethan's expression softened. "That passion is why you're exactly what this town needed." Something in his tone made Grace look up, catching an intensity in his gaze that sent a flutter through her chest. The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken feelings, until Grace finally broke it by reaching for her shawl. "Shall we go? I find I'm famished after all." The hotel restaurant was Kelton's finest establishment, which wasn't saying much by Eastern standards, but represented the height of local sophistication. They were seated at a small table near the window, where they could observe the street as the town settled into evening routines. Their dinner conversation flowed easily, covering the day's events, the personalities of various students, and Grace's plans for the curriculum. Ethan proved an attentive listener, offering insights about the families that helped her understand her students' backgrounds better. "The Wilson boys will be your biggest challenge," he commented as they finished their meal. "Their father doesn't see much value in education, especially for boys who will likely follow him to the railroad." Grace frowned. "Mr. Wilson, is he the same man who was speaking to me after church yesterday?" Ethan nodded, a flicker of something displeasure, protectiveness, crossing his features. "The same. Has he bothered you?" "Not exactly bothered," Grace chose her words carefully. "He was forward. Mentioned that a woman alone might appreciate a man's protection." She shook her head slightly. "I made it clear I'm quite capable of managing on my own." "Wilson has a reputation," Ethan said, his voice tight. "If he troubles you again, I'd like to know about it." Grace studied him for a moment. "Are you speaking as the deputy or as something else?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Ethan off guard. He met her gaze steadily. "Both, I suppose. As deputy, it's my duty to ensure the safety of all Kelton citizens. As a man who cares for you, I find the idea of Wilson's attention particularly objectionable." "You care for me," Grace repeated softly, not quite a question. "I think that's been evident for some time," Ethan replied, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "Despite my poor attempt at keeping a proper distance." Grace smiled. "I care for you too, Ethan, more than I expected to care for anyone when I set out west." The admission hung between them, simple but profound. Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly in a gesture that, while modest by some standards, represented a significant public acknowledgement of their growing attachment. "Would you like me to walk you home?" he asked as they finished their coffee. "I would like that very much." The evening had grown cool, stars emerging in the clear sky above Kelton. They walked slowly, their pace unhurried, savoring the companionship. As they reached the teacher's cottage, Grace paused at the gate. "Thank you for dinner, and for the flowers, and for—" She gestured vaguely, "everything since that night on the trail." "No need for thanks," Ethan said softly. "Knowing you has been its own reward." In the silver moonlight, his features seemed more defined, his eyes more intense. Grace found herself wondering what it would be like to be held by him, to feel the strength that had carried her to safety turn gentle in embrace. As if reading her thoughts, Ethan took a half-step closer. "Grace, he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Yes." She encouraged, her heart beating faster. "I'd like to call on you properly, with your permission." The formal request made her smile. "I'd like that very much, Ethan." He nodded, relief and pleasure mingling in his expression. Then, with careful deliberation, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, chaste but unmistakably affectionate. "Good night, Grace. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. "Until tomorrow." As she watched him walk away, Grace touched her cheek, marveling at how much her life had changed in such a short time. From the brink of death to the threshold of love, It was more than she could have imagined when she'd set out from Boston. The frontier was harsh and unpredictable, but it had given her something precious. A second chance, a new beginning, and perhaps a heart to match her own. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their courtship. Ethan called on Grace regularly, escorting her to Sunday services and community gatherings. They took walks along Kelton's quieter streets on evenings when the weather permitted, gradually learning each other's histories, preferences, and dreams. Grace flourished as Kelton's teacher. Her natural ability to connect with children, combined with her genuine passion for education, won over even the most reluctant students. The Wilson boys, initially her greatest challenge, had begun to show improvement after Grace discovered their aptitude for practical mathematics and incorporated more hands-on lessons involving measurement and calculation. Harvey Wilson, however, remained a troubling presence. Though he had stopped making direct overtures to Grace after it became clear she was being courted by the deputy, his resentment was palpable. He made disparaging remarks about book learning whenever Grace was within earshot, and had twice withdrawn his sons from school for days at a time, claiming they were needed for work. "I worry about those boys," Grace confided to Ethan one evening as they sat on the bench in her small garden. October had brought cooler temperatures, and she had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "They're bright, especially Thomas, but their father seems determined to deny them any opportunity for advancement." Ethan sighed. "Wilson's a bitter man. His wife left him 3 years ago, couldn't take the isolation and his drinking. He blames everyone but himself for how his life turned out." "That's terribly sad," Grace said, "but it doesn't excuse taking it out on his children." "No, it doesn't." Ethan's expression hardened. "I've had more confrontations with Wilson than anyone else in Kelton. He's always just on the edge of real trouble, drunk enough to be belligerent but sober enough to back down before I have to arrest him." Grace hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "Is he dangerous, do you think? Truly dangerous, I mean?" Ethan considered this carefully. "Most men aren't dangerous until they are," he said finally. "Wilson harbors resentments and drinks to dull them. That's a volatile combination. I don't think he'd harm the boys. He's rough with them, but not cruel. As for others," he shrugged, "I keep a close eye on him." The conversation turned to pleasanter topics, but Grace couldn't entirely dismiss her unease about Harvey Wilson. There was something in the way he looked at her when Ethan wasn't present, a mixture of resentment and something else she couldn't quite identify. She resolved to be especially vigilant when his sons were in her care, looking for any signs of mistreatment that might require intervention. As November approached, preparations began for Kelton's Thanksgiving celebration. The harvest had been good, the railroad business steady, and the town had much to be grateful for. A community feast was planned, with each family contributing dishes to be shared in the town hall, a simple building that served multiple functions from court proceedings to social gatherings. Grace's students created decorations for the event, painting autumn scenes and writing poems of gratitude to be displayed. The excitement was palpable, especially among the younger children who had never experienced such a communal celebration. The day before Thanksgiving, as Grace was dismissing her students, Sheriff Patterson arrived at the schoolhouse door. His expression was grave, and he waited until the last child had departed before speaking. "Miss Norwood, there's been an incident at the railroad yard. Harvey Wilson was injured. A coupling mechanism failed while he was working on it." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "How serious is it?" "Serious enough. Dr. Simmons is with him now. His right leg was crushed. He may lose it." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I've come about the boys. Someone needs to tell them and look after them until we know more." "Of course," Grace said immediately. "They can stay with me. I have a spare room and they know me well enough to be comfortable." The sheriff looked relieved. "That's kind of you. I'll send Ethan to help get them settled once he returns." "Returns? Where is he?" "Escorting a prisoner to the county seat. Armed robbery at Miller's farm last week. He should be back by nightfall." After the sheriff left, Grace hurriedly prepared her cottage for the Wilson boys. She made up the small second bedroom with fresh linens, set out extra towels, and began preparing a hearty stew that would feed them all. By the time she walked to the Wilson home, a dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town, to collect the boys and explain what had happened, the sun was setting. Thomas, the elder at 13, took the news stoically, though his eyes betrayed his worry. James, only 10, was more visibly upset. Grace helped them pack a few belongings, assuring them they could return for anything else they needed later. "Will Pa die?" James asked as they walked back toward town, his small hand clutching Grace's tightly. "Dr. Simmons is an excellent physician," Grace answered carefully. "He's doing everything possible for your father." Thomas, walking slightly ahead, glanced back. "Pa's strong," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "He'll be all right." Grace wished she could offer more reassurance, but the truth was that injuries like Wilson's often proved fatal, if not from the immediate trauma, then from subsequent infection. The best she could do was provide stability for the boys until the situation became clearer. At the cottage, she fed them the stew she'd prepared, encouraged them to wash up, and settled them in the spare room with some books. Thomas pretended disinterest, but took The Adventures of Tom Sawyer when he thought she wasn't looking. James, less guarded, accepted Treasure Island with genuine enthusiasm. It was nearly 9 o'clock when a knock came at the door. Grace opened it to find Ethan, still dusty from the trail and looking exhausted but concerned. "Sheriff Patterson told me what happened," he said without preamble. "How are the boys?" "As well as can be expected," Grace replied, stepping back to let him enter. "They're in the spare room now. I think James might be asleep already, but Thomas is likely still reading." Ethan nodded, removing his hat. "And Wilson?" "I haven't heard anything new. The doctor was still with him when we left." "I'll check in at the clinic after I leave here," Ethan said. "See if there's any news." He hesitated, then added, "It's good of you to take them in." Grace smiled softly. "What else would I do? They're my students and they have nowhere else to go right now." Ethan's expression softened with admiration. "Not everyone would see it that way." "Well, I'm not everyone," Grace replied with a hint of mischief. "Would you like some coffee before you go to the clinic? You look tired." "Coffee would be wonderful," Ethan admitted. "It's been a long ride." While Grace prepared the coffee, Ethan quietly checked on the boys, returning to report that both were indeed asleep, books still open beside them. They sat at Grace's small table, speaking in low voices about the events of the day. "How was your journey?" Grace asked, noting the lines of fatigue around Ethan's eyes. "Uneventful, thankfully. The prisoner wasn't inclined to make trouble. He'll stand trial next month." Ethan rubbed his eyes. "I hate being away when things happen here." "You can't be everywhere at once," Grace pointed out gently. "And the sheriff managed the situation well." Ethan nodded, but she could see he was still troubled. "Wilson's accident changes things for the boys, regardless of whether he recovers. He won't be able to work for months, if ever." "What will happen to them?" Grace asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind since the sheriff's visit. "Depends," Ethan sighed. "If Wilson survives but is disabled, they might be able to stay together with assistance from the town. If he doesn't—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Grace understood the implication. Orphaned children on the frontier often faced separation, sent to relatives if they had any or to orphanages if they didn't. They have no other family, none that I know of. Their mother left no forwarding address when she departed, and Wilson never mentioned relatives. Grace's heart ached for the sleeping boys. "They can stay with me as long as necessary," she declared. "I have the space, and they're good children despite their circumstances." Ethan studied her face in the lamplight. "You do that. Take responsibility for two boys you barely know." "I know them better than you might think," Grace replied. "I see them every day in my classroom. Thomas has a gift for mathematics and a secret love of literature. James draws beautifully and asks the most insightful questions. They deserve stability and care, whoever provides it." Something shifted in Ethan's expression, admiration deepening into something more profound. "Grace," he said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand, "you are a remarkable woman." The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through her. "I'm only doing what I believe is right." "That's what makes it remarkable," Ethan insisted. "Many people know what's right, but lack the courage or compassion to act on it." Their eyes held, the moment stretching between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Then Ethan reluctantly released her hand and stood. "I should go to the clinic, see how Wilson is faring." Grace nodded, rising as well. "Will you come by in the morning to let the boys know?" "First thing," Ethan promised. At the door he paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Grace, when this situation is resolved, there's something important I want to discuss with you." "What is it?" she asked, curious. "Something better saved for a time without immediate worries," he replied with a small smile. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Ethan. Be careful out there." After he left, Grace checked once more on the sleeping boys before retiring to her own room. As she prepared for bed, her mind returned to Ethan's parting words. What did he want to discuss that required a more peaceful moment? The possibilities made her heart flutter with anticipation and a touch of nervousness. Whatever it was, it would have to wait. For now, there were two vulnerable boys depending on her and a community crisis to navigate. Grace fell asleep with a prayer for Harvey Wilson's recovery and for wisdom to handle whatever challenges the coming days might bring. The news that arrived with the dawn was grim, but not unexpected. Harvey Wilson had survived the night, but Dr. Simmons had been forced to amputate his right leg below the knee to prevent the spread of infection. The procedure had been performed without the benefit of hospital facilities, relying on ether for anesthesia, and the doctor's considerable experience with frontier medicine. Ethan delivered the news to Grace first, arriving at her cottage before the boys were awake. "He's still unconscious," he explained in low tones. "Dr. Simmons says the next 24 hours are critical. If infection sets in, there's little more he can do." Grace absorbed this soberly. "How should I tell the boys?" "Honestly, but with hope," Ethan advised. "They need to understand the gravity of the situation without being overwhelmed by it." When Thomas and James awoke, Grace provided a simple breakfast before explaining their father's condition as gently as possible. Thomas received the news with the same stoic expression he'd shown the previous day, but James's eyes filled with tears. "Can we see him?" the younger boy asked, his voice small. Ethan, who had stayed to support Grace, answered carefully. "Not just yet, James. Your father needs complete rest to heal, but as soon as Dr. Simmons says it's all right, we'll take you to him." "What about school?" Thomas asked, practical even in crisis. "School is canceled today," Grace informed them. "The town council felt it best given the circumstances. We'll decide about tomorrow later." The boys spent the morning helping Grace with chores around the cottage. their need for normalcy and purpose evident in their eager assistance. In the afternoon, Ethan returned with permission from Dr. Simmons for a brief visit to their father, who had regained consciousness, but remained heavily sedated. The clinic was hushed when they arrived, Dr. Simmons greeting them in the front room with instructions delivered in a low, serious tone. "He's very weak," the doctor cautioned. "Keep the visit short and try not to upset him. He needs rest above all." The boys nodded solemnly, and Grace gave each of them a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before they were led into the small recovery room. She and Ethan remained outside, giving the family their privacy. "How is he really?" Ethan asked once the boys were out of earshot. Dr. Simmons removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. "In honest terms, it's touch and go. The amputation itself went as well as could be expected, but these procedures are always risky. Infection is the greatest danger now." Grace felt a chill at the gravity in the doctor's tone. "And if he recovers, what then? Physically, he'll need time to heal before he can be fitted with a prosthetic limb. Mentally," the doctor shrugged. "That's harder to predict. Some men adapt to such losses with remarkable resilience. Others never reconcile themselves to their changed circumstances. And given Wilson's history," Ethan added grimly, "his temperament doesn't suggest resilience." Before the conversation could continue, the door to the recovery room opened and the boys emerged. Thomas looked pale but composed, while James was openly crying. Grace immediately went to them, drawing James into a comforting embrace while placing a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "He didn't even know us," James sobbed against her skirt. "He just stared at the ceiling." "The medicine makes him very drowsy," Dr. Simmons explained kindly. "It doesn't mean he doesn't know you. It's just helping him rest and heal." Thomas looked up at the doctor with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "Is our pa going to die?" The directness of the question hung in the air. Dr. Simmons glanced at Grace and Ethan before answering with careful honesty. "I'm doing everything I can to prevent that, Thomas. Your father is fighting hard. We must all hope and pray for the best." It seemed a thin comfort, but the boy nodded, accepting the uncertain prognosis with the same stoicism he'd shown throughout. Grace's heart ached for him, a child forced to contemplate orphanhood, to shoulder adult worries while barely into his teens. The walk back to the cottage was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Grace prepared dinner while the boys sat at her small table, James drawing pictures on scraps of paper while Thomas stared out the window. Ethan had returned to his duties, but promised to come by later with any updates. As Grace served the simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, she noticed Thomas watching her with an unreadable expression. "Is something wrong with the food, Thomas?" she asked gently. The boy shook his head. "No, madam. I was just thinking that Pa never cooked like this. Mostly it was beans from a can or whatever we could heat up quick." "Your father works hard," Grace replied, careful to use the present tense. "Cooking takes time that many working men don't have." "Our ma used to cook real nice," James volunteered unexpectedly, before she left. "She made pies sometimes." Thomas shot his brother a warning look, but Grace pretended not to notice. "Perhaps we could make a pie together sometime," she suggested. "I have a good recipe for apple pie that my mother taught me." James brightened at this, while Thomas maintained his guarded expression. Grace didn't push further, understanding that the older boy's reserve was a form of self-protection. Trust would come with time, if circumstances allowed for it. After dinner, she encouraged the boys to read while she tidied up. James settled eagerly with his book, but Thomas approached her at the washing basin. "Miss Norwood," he began hesitantly, "what's going to happen to us if Pa doesn't get better?" The The question, though expected, still caught Grace by surprise in its directness. She turned to face him fully, drying her hands on her apron. "Thomas, that's not something you need to worry about right now. Your father is receiving the best care possible." "But if," the boy persisted. "If he doesn't, James and me, we don't have anybody else." Grace knelt to his eye level, struck by the maturity and fear competing in his young face. "Thomas, listen to me. No matter what happens, you and James will not be alone, I promise you that." "How can you promise? You're not our kin." "No, I'm not," Grace acknowledged. "But I am your teacher, and more than that, I care about what happens to you. The whole town does. We take care of our own in Kelton." Thomas studied her face, searching for signs of insincerity. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, for he gave a small nod. "Thank you, Miss Norwood." "You're welcome, Thomas. Now, why don't you join your brother? Reading might help take your mind off worries for a while." The boy complied, selecting a book from Grace's small collection and settling into the chair opposite James. Watching them, Grace was struck by the responsibility she had assumed. Her promise to Thomas hadn't been empty reassurance, she meant every word. Whatever happened with Harvey Wilson, she was committed to ensuring these boys had stability and care. When Ethan arrived later that evening, he brought news that Wilson's condition remained unchanged, neither improving nor deteriorating significantly. The boys had already been settled in bed, exhausted by the emotional strain of the day. "You look tired," Ethan observed as Grace poured him coffee. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she insisted automatically, then sighed at his skeptical expression. "All right, I'm worried. For the boys, for their father, for what comes next, one day at a time," Ethan advised, reaching across to take her hand. "That's all any of us can do." Grace squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thomas asked me today what would happen to them if their father doesn't recover. What did you tell him?" "That they wouldn't be alone, that Kelton takes care of its own." She met his gaze directly. "I meant it, Ethan. Whatever happens, I won't see those boys separated or sent away." Ethan's expression softened with something like wonder. "You'd take them in permanently, become their guardian, if necessary." "Yes," Grace confirmed. "They need stability, education, and care. I can provide that." "It's a tremendous responsibility to consider," Ethan cautioned. "Raising two boys alone, especially one as old as Thomas, won't be easy." "I'm aware," Grace replied. "But what's the alternative? Send them to an orphanage, split them up among strangers. I couldn't live with myself." Ethan was quiet for a moment, studying their intertwined hands. Then he looked up, his expression resolved. "You wouldn't have to do it alone, Grace." Her heart skipped a beat at the implication in his words. "What do you mean?" "I've been wanting to speak with you about our future," Ethan said, his voice low and earnest. "This isn't how I planned to do it, but perhaps it's fitting, given the circumstances." Grace felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with nervousness. "Our future." "Grace, from the moment I found you on that trail, something changed in me. I've lived a solitary life by choice for many years, focused on my duties and little else. But knowing you, seeing your courage and compassion has made me want more." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Grace. I believe I've loved you since that first night when you fought so hard to live." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. "Oh, Ethan. I had planned to court you properly for a few more months before asking," he continued, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "But life doesn't always accommodate our plans. So I'm asking now. Would you consider becoming my wife? Not just for the boys' sake, though I would welcome them as my own, but because I want to build a life with you." Grace felt as though her heart might burst with the sudden rush of emotion. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but he leaned across the table and sealed their engagement with a tender kiss there first. It was brief but full of promise, a pledge of the life they would build together. When they parted, Ethan kept his face close to hers. "Whatever happens with Wilson, whatever challenges come, we'll face them together." "Together," Grace echoed, feeling as though, against all odds, she had found her true home in the wilderness. Harvey Wilson died 2 days later without regaining full consciousness. Infection had set in despite Dr. Simmons's best efforts, and his weakened body couldn't fight any longer. The news was delivered to Grace by Sheriff Patterson early in the morning, before the boys were awake. "I'll tell them," Grace said quietly after absorbing the sheriff's words. "They should hear it from someone they trust." Breaking the news to the boys was the hardest thing Grace had ever done. James cried openly, seeking comfort in her embrace, but Thomas received the information with an eerie calm that worried her more than tears would have. "I knew he wasn't going to make it," the older boy said flatly. "Ever since we saw him at the doctor's." "I'm so very sorry, Thomas," Grace said, reaching for his hand. He allowed the contact but remained rigid, his young face a mask of controlled emotion. The funeral was held the following day, a simple affair attended by most of the town. Harvey Wilson had not been well liked, but Kelton's citizens turned out to support his orphaned sons and to mark the passage of one of their own. Thomas and James stood on either side of Grace, with Ethan a solid presence behind them. When the minister invited mourners to say a few words, no one stepped forward until, unexpectedly, Thomas released Grace's hand and walked to the edge of the grave. "My pa wasn't always an easy man," he began, his young voice clear in the autumn air. "He worked hard and did his best after Ma left. He taught us to be strong and never complain, even when things were bad." The boy paused, struggling for words. "I want him to know we'll be all right. We'll be strong like he wanted." The simple eulogy moved many to tears, including Grace. As Thomas returned to her side, she put her arm around his shoulders, feeling the slight tremor that belied his stoic expression. After the service, as mourners dispersed, Sheriff Patterson approached Grace, Ethan, and the boys. "We need to discuss arrangements," he said quietly. "For the boys' guardianship." Thomas stiffened beside Grace. "We're staying with Miss Norwood," he stated with unexpected firmness. "She promised." The sheriff glanced at Grace, who nodded confirmation. "I intend to provide a home for Thomas and James," she said. "However, there's something the boys should know." She knelt down to their level, taking each boy's hand in hers. "Deputy Keller has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. If it's all right with you, we would become your guardians together." James's eyes widened, like a new ma and pa. "Not to replace your parents," Ethan clarified, joining Grace at eye level with the boys. "No one could do that. But yes, we would care for you and provide a home for you if that's what you want." Thomas studied them both with serious eyes. "Would we stay in Kelton? Keep going to school?" "Yes," Grace assured him. "Your education is very important, and Kelton is our home." The boy considered this, then gave a decisive nod. "All right." It wasn't exuberant acceptance, but from Thomas, it represented significant trust. James was less reserved, throwing his arms around Grace's neck in a tight hug before offering a shy one to Ethan as well. Sheriff Patterson, who had observed this exchange with approval, cleared his throat. "Well, that seems settled then. I'll draw up the guardianship papers to make it official." "When's the wedding to be?" Grace and Ethan exchanged glances. "Soon," Ethan replied. "Before winter sets in properly. No sense in a long engagement under the circumstances." And so it was that 3 weeks later, on a clear December morning, Grace Norwood and Ethan Keller were married in Kelton's small church. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the entire town. Thomas and James stood proudly with Ethan, dressed in new suits purchased for the occasion. Grace wore a gown of deep blue velvet, a gift from the women of Kelton who had pooled their resources to ensure the bride had something special for her wedding day. As they exchanged vows, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the brink of death on a lonely trail to standing before God and community, pledging her life to a man whose promise of a better morning had proved more prophetic than either could have imagined. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan's kiss was tender but full of promise, a pledge of the life they would build together, not just for themselves but for the two boys who now looked to them for guidance and love. The celebration afterward was joyous, the town hall transformed with evergreen boughs and ribbons for the occasion. There was dancing and feasting, laughter and a few happy tears. Even Thomas unbent enough to smile when Ethan showed him a simple waltz step, the boy's serious face lighting up with rare pleasure. As evening fell, the newlyweds and their charges returned to Ethan's cabin, larger than Grace's cottage and more suitable for a family of 4. They had spent the past weeks preparing it, adding furnishings and making adjustments to accommodate the boys comfortably. "Welcome home," Ethan said simply as they crossed the threshold. Grace looked around at the space that would be their family home, at the boys exploring their new room, at the books already arranged on shelves, at the man who had saved her life and now stood beside her as husband. "Home," she repeated, the word filled with wonder and gratitude. Later, after the boys had been settled in bed and the household had quieted, Grace and Ethan stood on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. His arm around her waist, he pulled her close against the December chill. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Beyond words," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "When you found me that night, I was certain I was going to die. Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for." "I told you you'd wake up to a better morning," Ethan reminded her with a smile, "though I had no idea just how much better our mornings would become." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "The best is yet to come," she promised, reaching up to touch his face with tender fingers. "For all of us." As their lips met in a kiss that sealed that promise, Grace knew with certainty that the journey that had begun in fever and fear had led her exactly where she was meant to be, to Kelton, to Ethan, to Thomas and James, to a life rich with purpose and love. Each morning would indeed be better than the last, not because the frontier had suddenly become less harsh or life less unpredictable, but because they would face whatever came together, as a family forged not by blood but by choice and circumstance, and, most of all, by love. Over the years that followed, their family became a cornerstone of Kelton's community. Grace continued teaching, eventually overseeing the construction of a proper schoolhouse as the town grew with the expanding railroad. Ethan served as deputy until Sheriff Patterson retired, when the town council unanimously appointed him as Kelton's new sheriff. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his natural mathematical abilities with a newfound love of literature. At 18, he left for college in Salt Lake City with Grace's encouragement and Ethan's blessing, returning with a degree in engineering to help extend the railroad further west. James discovered a talent for medicine while assisting Dr. Simmons as a boy, and eventually followed in his mentor's footsteps, studying in Denver before returning to Kelton as the aging doctor's partner. 2 years after their marriage, Grace and Ethan welcomed a daughter they named Elizabeth, who inherited her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet determination. 2 years later came Samuel, a robust boy whose cheerful nature brightened even the hardest days. There were challenges, of course, harsh winters, economic downturns when the railroad faltered, the inevitable conflicts of a growing town. But through it all, The promise Ethan had made on that fateful night held true. Each morning brought new opportunities, new joys, new chances to build the life they had forged from unlikely beginnings. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as their children, both blood and chosen, gathered around the large table that had replaced the small one in Ethan's bachelor cabin, Grace found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. Looking at her husband across the celebration, their eyes met in silent acknowledgement of how far they had come from that desperate night on the trail to Kelton. Later, when the younger children were asleep and Thomas and James had departed for their own homes in town, Grace and Ethan sat before the fire, hands intertwined as they had been countless times over the years. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Grace asked softly. "If you hadn't decided to patrol that particular trail that night," Ethan considered this, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on her palm. "I've always believed there was a reason I found you when I did. Not chance, but purpose. Divine intervention." Grace suggested with a smile. "Perhaps," Ethan acknowledged. "Or simply that two souls meant to find each other will, regardless of the circumstances." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the solid warmth of his presence. "Either way, I'm grateful. For you, for our children, for this life we've built." "As am I," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day with you has been that better morning I promised." Outside, the stars shone over Kelton, the same stars that had witnessed a fever-stricken woman's desperate journey and a deputy's fateful promise. The frontier remained vast and sometimes unforgiving, but within the walls of their home, Grace and Ethan had created a sanctuary of love and purpose that extended far beyond themselves, touching lives throughout the community they served. From the most unlikely beginnings, she fevered and frightened. He, a solitary lawman with a compassionate heart, had grown a love story that defined not just two lives but an entire community. It was, Grace reflected as she curled closer to her husband's side, the greatest blessing she could have imagined, waking each day to a morning made better by the family and purpose they had found together in the wild heart of Utah's frontier.